Thanks for inviting me. I'm just going to give a short introduction into how this session is going to work. So I was asked to cover the topic of the roles, responsibilities, and powers of governments. The way I envision this is it's mostly going to be a lecture. It's going to take probably around an hour, maybe a bit less, maybe a bit more, depending on how it goes. I'm going to try to cover, first of all, the concept of the state and the concept of governments in general. Then I'm going to talk a lot about, and the center of this lecture is going to be about democracy and democratic governments, because those are indeed the ones that most debates take place in, because most debates are settled in functional democracies. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the regulatory role of the state and how much the state should be involved in regulating markets or implementing welfare and similar policies. And then at the end, I just have a slide where you have 6 basic example motions that I guess you can take a screenshot of or write down and perhaps practice practice writing your arguments on those motions. There's going to be time for Q&A at the end, but also after every slide, I'm going to give about 30 seconds if anyone wants to jump in with a question at that particular point in time. So at this point, we're good to start. Let me just take a sip of water, and I'm going to be sharing my presentation very soon.
Oh no, आज मेरे सर ये हैं ये देखो
Okay. You guys all should be seeing this. So as I've said, the title of the presentation is The Roles, Responsibilities, and Power of Governments. I've already done a general flagging of how the lecture will progress, so there is no further barrier to move on to the first slide of the presentation. So before we even talk about how governments operate and what the roles are and responsibilities are of a government, we first need to define what a government is. We need to know the terms that we are operating with in the context of the lecture. And in order to define a government, we first need to define a state. And I'm just going to flag that throughout this lecture, I'm interchangeably going to use the terms state and government. You're going to see why that's the case as I proceed. The definition of a state that I chose to present for this lecture is one that I use in my academic work, and I'm going to explain why, is as defined by Max Weber, where Max Weber defines the state to be a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. What this means is that the state is the only one who is legally allowed to use force against people in a particular territory. You using force against other people without being allowed to do so by the state is illegal. You cannot beat someone up. You cannot kill someone legally. The state, however, is allowed to do that. The state is allowed to send the police to use physical force in certain situations. The state is allowed to use the military to use force in certain situations. So the state is the actor which in a particular territory claims a monopoly, meaning that it's the only one who can do so, over the legitimate use of physical force. Only the state can legitimately use physical force and physical coercion within a given area. The logic behind this is that the state is the disciplinary actor, so to say. The state serves to ensure, and we're going to get into this a little bit more as I come to the arguments and reasons as to why states are even created in the first place. The state exists to ensure that there is discipline and order within a community instead of chaos. And in order to do so, the state often needs to use violence in the form of the police and sometimes the military and the coercive force of the law in general in order to ensure that that happens. The state, defined as such, is operationalized as government. It is the government who carries out the legitimate use of physical force by the state. The government can be understood as a group of people, of institutions, ministries, agencies, departments, and various governmental structures that in the name of the state wield this coercive power. So when we talk about the government, we talk about a group of individuals, institutions, and structures that are in charge of administering the coercive power of the state. In order to understand the nature of the state, we must ask the question of how and why states are created. Why do we live in a world where humans organize themselves into states as opposed to any other form of organization? There are two theoretical explanations I'm going to provide. I'm also going to flag that these are not the only two, and I'm also going to flag that there are variations and nuances within those two that I'm not going to be talking about here. But I picked out these particular two interpretations because I feel that not only are they the most relevant in academia, but they're also going to be the ones that you are going to be using for your debate arguments at tournaments that you will be attending, etc. The first explanation of why states are created is social contract theory. Social contract theory starts from the premise that before the creation of a state, we live in what is called a state of nature, which is to say there is no law, there is no order, and there is no authority, which is to say that any human can harm another human at any given point in time. There is nothing, apart from perhaps me being physically weaker or less able, that's stopping me from stealing from you, harming you, killing you ultimately, and there's nothing that's stopping you from doing that to me. It's a world where humans perpetually have to fear other humans because you never know when somebody else is going to harm you. Even if you're the strongest kid on the block, once you fall asleep beneath a tree, somebody can come and bludgeon you to death with a hammer or with an axe or something like that. The state, therefore, springs as a response to the state of nature. The state is created as a way to escape the state of nature, which is to say, we all agree, and this is why the theory is called social contract theory. We all agree that we are going to give up part of our rights and our freedoms to a government, to a state, to an authority, to a sovereign. So we are going to allow somebody to rule over us, to impose laws on us, to punish us if we don't follow those laws. So we give up our absolute freedom and we accept only limited freedom. But in exchange, we get a guarantee of safety. We get a guarantee that the limited rights and freedoms that we do keep are protected by government. We agree between each other as humans that we are not going to cause harm to each other, and we also agree there's an authority above us that can punish us if we do commit harm against each other and if we do levy certain harms against each other. Which is to say, the state is a situation, the creation of the state is a situation where we agree to give up our absolute freedoms for the protection of the remainder of our freedoms and for a certain, at least relative guarantee of safety. What's important to keep in mind is two things. First of all, the social contract is a thought experiment, right? Nobody ever sat down at a table and actually signed a social contract, but it's a thought experiment to explain the reason behind why states form. The second thing that's key to understand is that to the extent to which we have relinquished some of our rights and granted them to the sovereign, to the government, to the state, however you will, to govern over us, this also implies certain duties of the government and certain limitations on what the government can do. We legitimately expect of the government to enforce the law of the land that it has imposed over that land. We legitimately expect the government to provide us with minimal physical safety, because the reason why we have given part of our rights to the government is to do exactly that. There are also limitations to what the government can ask us to do. One of the strongest arguments, for example, against military conscription, so the ability of the state to draft you into the army, is to say that the social contract is only valid insofar as the state upholds its part of the bargain by protecting your life. At the point where the state asks you to risk your life and perhaps die for the state, it has gone beyond the boundaries of the social contract. It has asked you to do the one exact thing that it's not allowed to ask you to do, because that was the reason why you signed the social contract in the first place. So it's a reciprocal relationship. There are duties of the government towards the citizens as well. Now, within social contract theory, there are more conservative and more liberal interpretations. So conservative interpretations are going to emphasize a more negative view of human nature, going to emphasize that humans are naturally selfish, naturally greedy, that it is in our instinct, in our genes to harm other people for our own benefit, and that we need the state to discipline this selfish gene, to impose authority because humans otherwise could never coexist. more liberal interpretations of contract theory would emphasize a more positive view of human nature. They would say that humans are fundamentally rational. Humans are able to calculate benefits and harms and are therefore both able and willing to cooperate. That any human would realize, because we are reasonable creatures, that trading with someone or exchanging, skills and talents with someone is better than being afraid that that someone is going to kill us. So conservative views are going to emphasize more of this animalistic human nature. Liberal views will emphasize more of the rationalistic human nature. But all interpretations of contract theory come from the basic logic I've described here. The last thing I want to note here is that all forms and iterations of social contract theory emphasize that political and legal orders are artificial creations, which is to say there is no a priori political order. Political orders and legal orders are created because humans decided that it's the best way to organize their lives, and they exist only so long as humans continually wish to maintain them. If we lived in a world where most people did not want to be part of a state, states would probably disappear because it is human maintenance that keeps states alive. The second interpretation of how states are created, which is not necessarily mutually exclusive with the first, so it can coexist with social contract theory, it just emphasizes other elements, is that the state is a reification, or if you will, a realization of a nationality, of a national idea. This theory emphasizes that all states today, or the vast majority of them at least, are nation states. They're states which represent a certain nationality. So Croatia is the state of Croatians. India is the nation state of Indians, whereas France is the nation state of the French. Which is to say the state is, as we've already defined, a group of institutions, of laws, of structures, which represents and organizes the life of a political nation. When I use the term nation, I will use the definition provided by Benedict Anderson, which is that the nation is an imagined political community of horizontal brotherhood. Let's unpack this definition. Why is a nation an imagined political community? Because if we take a look at Croatia, Croatia has like 3.8 million people. It's a lot smaller than India, for example. I will never meet the vast majority of Croatians that live in this country ever in my life. I will not know their names. I will not know their faces. I will not know their lives. I, however, still feel some form of connection to these individuals. I feel that we belong to the same community. I'm going to cheer when Croatian footballers score a goal, but I'm not going to cheer when Slovenian footballers score a goal because they're not part of my community. So although I do not know these people, I feel we belong within the same community. So it's not a real community I have, it is an imagined community I have. I imagine that I am part of the same community because we speak the same language, because we have the same history, because we have the same culture, because many of us have the same religion, etc. Why is it a community of horizontal brotherhood? Because very often people are willing to sacrifice for their nation, from the most basic level of, paying taxes and obeying the law, but to a more extreme level of being willing to lay down their lives for the nation, to go to war, to protect the territory, to protect those other people that live in this land that we consider to be our brothers and sisters, although we do not know them. This imagined community of the nation is institutionalized within the state, because when we have a state, we have clear borders. These borders separate us from other nations. Because we have nation states, we know where the land of the Croatians ends and the land of the Serbs begins geographically. When you take the example of perhaps South and Southeast Asia, we know where the land of India stops and where the land of Bangladesh, for example, begins. So states give us a way to not only organize our lives as a nation, to not only feel that we are a nation, but to be organized as one, to vote, to get educated, to get healthcare, to get welfare within this particular national community. But it also allows us to delineate ourselves from other nations. This is why I will stress the importance of language and of symbolism, because part of how the state reinforces this feeling of community is through state reinforcement of things like, for example, teaching your language, your culture, your literature through education. But it's also in the symbolism. When you have a nation state, Croatia has an anthem, Croatia has a flag, Croatia has a crest, Croatia has certain other, symbols like holidays and rituals, which are all institutionalized within the state and the laws of the state. So the state reinforces this feeling of national community. So to wrap this all up, it is to say that the state springs up. The state exists as a realization, as a political realization of the nation as an imagined community. The last thing I want to note here is that the fact that the national community is imagined doesn't mean it's false or that it's fiction. It does exist in political reality. It just doesn't exist in material reality. So I don't go to have a beer with 3 million Croatians in my country. But the feeling of me belonging to that community is still very much real. So the term imagined communities doesn't make them fake communities, so to say. Okay, before I move on to the next slide, I'll allow up to like 30 seconds, 1 minute, if there are any questions here.
If you have a question, you can also ask in the chat. I will read it out. Yes. No questions. Okay.
There seems to be none. So
there's a one question. Sanskrit, go ahead.
No, sir. I was just telling it was clear enough, so I don't have any.
Okay, fair.
Okay, I'll move on to the next slide. So here I want to talk about the relationship between the state and the individual. And here is where I want to introduce the state power principle, which is an argument I really like to run. I've run in many debates. And
yeah, I think just want to add to it. Look, debaters, I guess this is one of the reason where, this is one of the principle of 10, which is quite famous in the debating circuit. And a lot of debaters have learned this from 10's workshops video. And one of the reason we invited him. So, pay full attention.
Yeah. So why I want to discuss this at this particular point in the lesson? Because on the last slide, we talked about why states are created. And we talked about how people give up part of their rights to the state and part of their freedoms to the state, or the government, if you will. Doesn't matter, I will use interchangeably, in order to get protection in return. So this already opens up the question of the relationship between the state and the individual. And the premise of the state power principle is as follows. The state, at any given point in time, has and exercises disproportionate power over the individual. The state has a lot more power over you than you will ever have over the state. There are 3 distinct ways in which this is true. Firstly, the policy that the state creates through its legislation and executes through its executive branch of government controls and shapes the material conditions of your existence. The framework within which you exist is incredibly shaped by state policy. Is education free, or do you have to pay for it? Is healthcare free, or is it privatized like in the United States of America to a significant extent? Does the state have a meaningful welfare net and various welfare schemes that people can apply to or be eligible for, or does it not? Does the state enforce mandatory military conscription, or does it not? All of these policies shape the way in which your day-to-day life works. Ultimately, how much taxes do you pay influences how much money you have at the end of the month. So the framework within which you pursue happiness, however you define happiness, whatever you think is a happy life for you, is defined and limited or enabled, depending on the type of policy, by the policies that the state creates. So the framework of your life and how you live your life is ultimately defined by the state. Secondly, the state can and will employ coercive measures to ensure obedience. The state has the law, which it enforces through the courts. It can put you in prison if you are not in compliance, and you don't really have capacity to resist that. If you try to resist, the state will send the police, who will forcibly arrest you and detain you. And in the most extreme of situations, the state has the power of the military, which we have seen throughout the years and the centuries, has been used to pacify people in situations where governments found themselves in a position where they decided that they had to go to that extreme. So, for example, when in America, when in the 1960s, schools were desegregated, so people of color were allowed to have their children go to same schools as white children, the unrest in some southern states of the USA was so big that JFK had to send in the federal military to pacify the situation. But the logic is that the state has a huge amount of coercive power, including firepower, literal guns, that it can and will use against you if you don't listen, and you don't have the capacity to resist it. So you are forced to obey the state, even if you disagree. And the third thing is that you're unable to run away from this, because the state as a concept, as a framework within which you live, is fundamentally unavoidable. You can move within states, right? Between states. If you decide you don't like India, you can move to China or to the USA or to wherever else you want. You want to come to Croatia, but you're still going to be within a state. So you can move between states, but being below the yoke, under the yoke of a state is fundamentally unavoidable. Even if you did find a way to somehow be stateless, to go to a part of the world where there is no state, you would not have any rights guaranteed to you, because the only way in which your human rights and your civic rights are guaranteed to you is through the state and through the law. If you go to a place where there's no state, there's also no law. So even if you found a way to become stateless, you would find yourself in a situation where you have no rights whatsoever. So from all of this, it follows that the state is overbearing and inevitable. What follows from all of this, and this is the conclusion of the state power principle, that the precondition for you to have any meaningful form of agency of how to pursue your definition of happiness is that you need to have a capacity to influence how the state exercises this disproportionate power over you. Because the power is always going to be disproportionate. The only way for you to be able to realize your own definition of happiness, therefore you as a person with a dignified life, your vision of a dignified life, is to have some control over the state. And this is the principle which you can use in various debates where you have to, argue for democracy, argue for expanding the voting power, argue for expanding the amount of influence citizens have over the state. The reason why this principle is important for us, for the continuation of this lecture on a general sense, not just in a debate sense, is because if this principle is true, if the assumptions behind this principle are true, that the state has this huge amount of power over people, then we have a key question that we have to answer from the perspective of political theory and from the perspective of comparative politics. How do we create a system of government that will guarantee that this disproportionate power of the state is exercised legitimately and does not become tyranny? So how do we ensure that we avoid tyrannical government is a crucial question in devising a political system. And I'm going to be answering that for the majority of this lecture through explaining why democracy, although flawed, is most likely the best answer to that question. Before I move on to democratic government and the principles of democratic government, which will be the crux of my talk today, again, up to a minute for any potential questions.
Hello, I got a question. So for this principle, it is not possible for me to argue that authoritarian state is better, right? Because the question after this these assumptions is that how the state does not become a tyranny.
I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you please type it in the chat in writing? Because I think that will be easier for me.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll wait until you do that. It's because the audio on my computer is very bad, so sometimes I don't hear exactly what people are saying.
One question, I guess, is could you reiterate the point C, the third point?
Yeah, sure. I'll do that while I'm waiting for the other question to be typed in the chat. So the point C essentially means that wherever in the world you live, you always live in a state. So you can never avoid the fact that there is a state having this amount of disproportionate power over you. Maybe you don't live in India and you live in Croatia, or you live in Serbia, or in the United States or Canada, but wherever you live, it's a state, which is to say that you can never avoid this disproportionate amount of power that a state has over you. The nuance within this point is to say, maybe you can, I don't know, move to an island somewhere in the Pacific where there is no state. Like you can find a way to be stateless. But if you live on a random island in the Pacific, not only is there nothing there, but there's nobody to guarantee your rights, right? Because your human rights are only guaranteed if there is a law that protects them. If there's no state, there's no law. So it's you either cannot avoid the state, or even if you can, you would find yourself in a situation where you are essentially defenseless, because the state and the law of the state is the only thing that protects you against other people and the potential for violence that could be committed against you. Right. I'm just still waiting for the. Okay, here's the question. So the question is, for this principle, it is impossible to argue that authoritarian states are justified. What can I argue for other forms of government? So first of all, I would say there is a way to say that there is some recourse within authoritarian states as well, although it's smaller. But there are ways to force an authoritarian state to change its ways. Protests are one of them. Every authoritarian state needs to maintain at least a minimal level of contentedness within the country so it doesn't implode into revolution. The second way to argue from the perspective of this principle would be to say that sometimes authoritarian states are a product of democratic choice. There is a potentially, controversial statement that I would make, but I stand behind it as a political scientist. Almost all of the totalitarian regimes created through the past initially were democratic. There would never have been a Nazi Germany without there being a significant amount of people who supported Hitler. There never would have been a Soviet Union without enough people to participate in the February Revolution and the October Revolution, or to participate in Mao's Long March in China. But I think the last way to argue within the framework of this principle is to say that there are other ways in which authoritarian states provide for the pursuit of happiness. So here's what you can do. You can flip the principle. You can say the ultimate conclusion of this principle is that it is important for people to be able to pursue their own definition of happiness, right? And the principle makes the assumption that in order to do that, you need to control the state. But what if the authoritarian state, specifically because it's not controlled by the people, because there's no democracy, no democratic bureaucracy, no parliamentary debates, is more effective at giving people the things they need to pursue their happiness? What if the authoritarian state is better at giving people education for free, healthcare for free, employment, food on the table? If an authoritarian state is better able to provide people those preconditions to pursue happiness, then maybe we don't need to control the state in order for happiness to be pursued. These are some of the ways in which you can argue for authoritarian regimes. I would posit that it's generally hard to argue for authoritarianism, and most debates are not going to force you to argue for authoritarianism outright. You might be forced to argue that a stable authoritarian country is better than an unstable democracy or something like that. But most debate motions will not put you in the position where you have to argue that a dictatorship, for example, is openly a good thing. Okay, so the follow-up is, it is 50-50 in reality in terms of positive and negative outcomes. Some are dictatorships. I agree. Some countries are indeed dictatorships. But if we are talking from a debating perspective, in the majority of situations, you will not have to argue that the dictatorship is good. This is unlikely to happen in debating. There are also some objective reasons why dictatorships are unethical, which is also why you will not be forced to argue for that position. Right. Seeing as there's nothing else, let's move on to the next slide. Here, I want to move on to the principles of democratic government. So the answer, which I'm going to also defend here, and this is not to say that democracy is not flawed. It's very flawed in many of its elements. It has to consistently be maintained and reformed. But I will stand for the position that the answer to the final question on the previous slide, which is, how do we ensure that government doesn't become tyranny? The democracy is the best answer to that question. Now, again, we need to start from a definitional position. the definitional question. What is democracy? How do we define democracy? Or better yet, how we measure democracy? I would define democracy as a political system that seeks to maximize three different variables. One, accountability. The idea that those who engage in official politics are in some way accountable to the people they represent, and that there are mechanisms to enforce this accountability, such as elections, such as referenda, etc. Secondly, is representation, which is to say that, again, those who exercise government, those who make part of the executive branch, the legislative branch, etc., in some way represent the population that they, in whose name they govern, and the interests and the preferences of that population. And lastly, it's participation. A democratic system depends on an active citizenry, a citizenry which goes out to vote, but not only goes out to vote, but also participates in activism, in protests, in campaigns, in strikes. And these three variables are mutually reinforcing, because the more the people participate, the more they're going to hold politicians to account, and the more they hold them to account, the more politicians have an incentive to represent those people. And then the more the people feel represented, the more they will be energized to participate, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. So the three variables are mutually reinforcing. In terms of measuring democracy, the more a political system is able to achieve these criteria, the more we can consider it a democracy. The reason why I went for defining democracy through measuring democraticness as opposed to giving one dictionary definition is because there is no such thing as a perfect democracy in this world we live in. All democracies have certain elements of what we would call democratic deficit, certain parts of their political operation that is not democratic or insufficiently democratic. So we can only talk in terms of more or less democratic, but not ideally democratic and undemocratic. That would be a very myopic way of looking at the world we live in. Now, how does democratic theory answer the question of providing people with an avenue to influence the state? Democratic theory starts from the assumption that all citizens are equal moral actors. That simply means that all humans inherently have equal worth. There is no individual who, by the very nature of their existence and their person, is more worthy than other people, and that all of these people, to an equal extent, have certain rights. The way these rights are defined differ from country to country, but they can be subsumed in the famous quote from the American Declaration of Independence, which is that all people have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idea is that people who are equal to one another as citizens and who have certain unalienable rights should be the carriers of political power. The question is now, and this I'm going to be answering on the following slides, how do we transform theory into practice? How do we get a system where citizens as equal moral actors with certain rights are carriers of political power, and a system which, under that assumption, maximizes accountability, representation, and participation, but also a system that works? So how do we get these values realized while maintaining the system as functional? And that's the question which I will be answering on the following slides. But again, if there are any questions at this point, 30 seconds, 1 minute for people to ideally type their questions in the chat. Okay, the question is, do we have to weigh among life, liberty, and happiness? That is a very good question. And the answer in most situations is yes. A lot of important political decisions weigh between these three variables and the nuances of these variables. When we had COVID-19, we fundamentally had a decision which was between life and liberty to an extent, which was, do we impose strict lockdowns and restrictions which significantly limit the people's liberty, which significantly limit people's happiness, but perhaps preserve life? We also had to weigh between different ways of preserving life. Because a COVID lockdown will maybe stop people from getting COVID and dying from COVID, but it's also going to cause higher unemployment, more people getting laid off from their jobs, people suffering from hunger, from starvation. Because of that, they don't have the money to pay for the basic necessities. So in which way do we do this? But it's also the basic debate between security and freedom, right? So when we are talking about, for example, protecting against terrorism, do we on the one hand go for a surveillance state to a certain extent, right? We have CCTV cameras everywhere. We have the Patriot Act in the USA where the government can, spy on anyone and have, say, listen to people's phone records and conversations and stuff like that, rigorous checks at airports or stuff like this, in order to, for example, prevent the terrorist threat? Or do we stand back from the amount of policing that we do in order to do so? It's also the question of policing. How much policing do we want? And in what areas and in which situations? So a very big majority of political decisions are either weighing between these three or within them, how to best achieve them or how to best preserve them. And I think this is also a very important thing to realize for debating. Every political decision is a trade-off. Every political decision harms someone. There is no political decision which doesn't have a beneficiary and a deficiary, somebody who is going to lose from this or be unhappy as a consequence of this. And politics then becomes a question of balancing, right? Which of these trade-offs is the best trade-off that we wanna go for. Right. There seem to have been no other questions in the meantime, so I'll move on to the next slide. Here, I want to begin answering the question of how to transform theory into practice. I'm going to answer this through 4 sub-questions or through 4 sub-themes. On this slide, I'm going to discuss the first 2 among them. So the first question is, how do we ensure that basic democratic values are upheld? So on the previous slide, we talked about how the basic democratic assumption is the idea that all citizens are equal moral actors with certain rights. How do we ensure that this is upheld? We ensure that by enshrining human rights and civil rights in law. We make them part of our constitutions, we make them part of our legal systems, and we enforce them through the mechanisms that a state has, such as the courts, etc. Why is this important? First of all, we need to understand that equality and freedom are not necessarily intuitive values. Some would say that humans are not equal, right? Some people are stronger and some are not. Some are more conventionally beautiful and some are not. Some are smarter than others. So the idea that humans are equal is not necessarily an intuitive idea, nor is it that all humans should be free. Perhaps there are some people who should not be free because they're perhaps dangerous to society. Or perhaps we as ourselves would be willing to give up our freedom or part of our freedom in order to be safer, happier, etc. So in order for people to buy into the idea that equality and freedom are the cornerstone of political society, we need to find commonality between people, something all people can agree on, a common denominator. And this is the idea that all people are born equal and free, which is to say we develop through our lives to become different people, and different systems of hierarchies and authorities in our lives are going to reward or punish us for that. Some of us are going to be more successful, some less successful. Some of us might indeed deserve to lose their freedom at some point in time because we're going to, I don't know, kill someone and go to prison. But at the moment of our birth, as human beings and nothing more than human beings, we are all equal in our rights and we are all born free. This is something everybody can agree on. However, in order to transform this agreement into a functional system, we must realize that rights do not exist within a vacuum. They only exist so far as they are upheld by political institutions which protect them. So in order to transform rights from a social convention into something with actual power, we need to codify them into law. And this is an important thing that you need to realize. People only have human and civil rights, where human rights are the rights you have as a human, and civil rights are the rights you have as a citizen. And whereas human rights are supposed to apply to all humans, civil rights do not equally apply to all people, depending on the country they live in. In Croatia, it is a civil right for you to enter into a life partnership with a person of the same sex. But you are not entitled within civil rights to marry a person of the same sex. In some countries, you might be allowed to marry a person of the same sex as a civil right. But to get back to this, people only have rights because they were granted those rights. Rights only exist as realities to the extent to which they're upheld by political institutions. So on a very basic level, if you go to North Korea and you say, I as a human have freedom of conscience and freedom of speech, Kim Jong-un is going to say, I don't care, you go to Gulag, and you're probably going to die somewhere in North Korean prison. The same applies to speaking out against Stalin in the USSR. So the fact that you claim that you have a human right doesn't mean anything if the state that you live in will not enforce that human right. So rights are only a reality so long as they are codified into law and so long as they are enforced. I will note that some of the dictatorial regimes of the 20th century did have human rights enshrined into law, right? So all of the socialist communist countries were essentially based on enlightenment conceptions of human rights and liberty. Just none of them enforce those, right? The North Korea is called Democratic People's Republic of North Korea. They have legally they have elections, but those elections are a sham. So it's not being enforced, right? So it's not only important to have it in law; it must be enforced. The second important question is how do we ensure a sustainable system while still maintaining citizens' political participation? Because we want people to participate. We said on the previous slide that participation is one of the crucial elements of democracy. And the way that this originally happened when democracy was in its origins in the Greek city-states such as Athens is there was direct democracy. So citizens directly controlled political institutions. The reason why that's impossible today is because of a sheer problem of size. Even in small countries like Croatia, there's almost 4 million people. We cannot all gather around a campfire, hold hands, and sing Kumbaya. So there needs to be a way for people to control government without having to directly participate in government. The next best option is representative democracy. We will elect a certain number of representatives, 100 or a couple hundred, who are going to speak in our name in the parliament. That creates laws in our name. And if we disagree with what they are doing, they are accountable to us through elections. We can remove them from power. And the way we then participate is through voting, through going to town hall meetings where we talk to our MPs, by sending emails to our MPs, by protesting, by going for referenda, signing petitions, and stuff like this. Now, there's an important question in political theory. When we have representative democracy, should political officials act as representatives or as delegates? What does this mean? A representative in the context of this question is a person who speaks in the name of a group, but is free to tailor the way in which they represent that group to the way in which they best believe that this group's interests should be resolved. So if you are a representative for a right-wing populist party who is against immigration, you as a representative would have freedom to argue for limiting migration in whichever way you think the interests of your constituents are best served. A delegate would be a person who directly voices the thoughts and interests of a particular group. So if you're a delegate for a anti-immigration constituency, what you do in parliament is you say all migrants out of the country now. I mean, I'm simplifying, of course, but the representative has some creative freedom to argue in a way that they think is best, whereas a delegate is only a spokesperson. They speak the mind of the people and nothing more than that. So this is a big debate in political theory and comparative politics. Which of these is the more legitimate way to have the people represented? Now, of course, it's an ideal type debate. So nobody is an ideal representative or an ideal delegate. So to an extent, you have to be a representative because you have to craft laws and bills, which your voters don't do. To an extent, you are a delegate because you're going to get voted out if you don't say what the voters think. But just a theoretical debate which can be interesting in particular context. Before I move on to the next two questions, again, up to half a minute for potential questions here. There generally seem to be no questions. Oh, there's one in the chat. If, let's say, we grant a person a right, but we know that the person will not be able to make a meaningful decision, is it justified? Can you give an example? I'm not sure what this means. Right, you can think about that, and then at the end of the next slide, you can just type later. Sure, that works. Good. Can you elaborate more on the differences between a representative and a delegate? So, a representative is a person who speaks in the name of a group, but they do not directly necessarily argue the thoughts and opinions of that group. So I'm a representative for a constituency which doesn't like immigration, but I am free to argue against immigration in whatever way I think is best for that group. Whereas a delegate, I am a person who says only that which I am certain that my voter group thinks. I am not in my own right an independent actor. I am just there to say what I was told to say by my voters, so to speak. Which is to say, it's a difference between whether you have the freedom to argue on your own, or you are just there as a messenger, a political messenger who transmits a message from their constituency. But as I said, it's always a combination of both. To some extent, you're always free to put your own ideas, how to say, in how to say, a bill or a law. But to another extent, you're always bound to your constituents as a delegate to some extent, because they can vote you out if you do not follow their bidding. Another question, is there an example of an elected candidate as delegate in any country? Not elected, but I would say that the best possible example of a delegate is the Electoral College in the USA. So the way elections for president in the USA work, it is that when you win a particular state, so you win in California, what you actually want are the votes of the electors from California. So the way the Electoral College works is every federal state in the USA has its own number of electors, which increases based on population. And when you win a federal state as candidate, you actually want the votes of the electors in that country. And who has more electors wins the election. Electors are expected to give their votes to the candidate who won the election. So if Joe Biden wins in California, you're expected to be a delegate in the Electoral College. You're expected, no matter what you think personally, to give the vote of yourself as the elector for Joe Biden. There are and have been minimal examples, like marginal examples, where there were unfaithful, electors who would not listen to the will of the people and who would vote how they wanted to do. But those are very, very few and far between. So the elector in the Electoral College is a delegate. They're not expected to think for themselves. They're just expected to do what the voters in that federal state told them to do by voting for one presidential candidate or the other. Okay. Let's move to the next slide while we're waiting for the previous question to be elaborated. Okay, the third question to discuss is how do we prevent the monopolization of political power? And that's a very important question, because let's say initially we have democracy, right? And we elect a government. What prevents this government from just saying, haha, fooled you, we're going to take all the power and we're going to be a dictatorship now? How do we prevent a government that's elected from just capturing the state and becoming a tyranny? There are two answers to this. The first is regular, free, and competitive elections, and the second is a separation of powers. First of all, external control. External control happens, as I've already said, via elections. They ensure two things. First of all, they ensure that state capture doesn't happen, that a government once elected is not governing forever. This is also why we have term limits, right? So you cannot be US president more than twice, for example. And it also ensures that there are multiple ideologies represented. So you're not going to have one party in parliament, you're going to have 2 or 3 or 4 or 6 or 7. So there are different ideologies represented in parliament, and very often governments are coalition governments. So in the government, you also have different views represented. However, of course, it's not always the case in practice. In some countries, you only realistically have one party which has governed for decades upon decades. For example, in South Africa, the African National Congress has been governing ever since apartheid has been abolished. In the USA, you don't really have much political choice because you only have the Democrats and the Republicans. Same goes for Croatia, where you have one center-right party, one center-left party. We generally push the same policies over and over again. But this is the theory. The second element of control is internal control, checks and balances within the system. In other words, separation of powers into three different branches. First is the legislative branch, embodied in the parliament. The parliament is the one that creates laws. The parliament is supposed to be representative as per election. The distribution of seats in the parliament is supposed to reflect the will of the people as it was demonstrated in an election. The existence of political opposition in parliament is crucial. Firstly, because there are some decisions which cannot be made without a super majority, for example, 66% of the vote, which ensures that the political opposition also has to agree, at least to a significant extent, with the government. There need to be enough people to cross the aisle to cooperate with the ruling party. Stuff like constitutional changes, or the impeachment of a president or a prime minister in certain countries, or a vote of no confidence in a president or prime minister in certain countries. But also, political opposition exists to criticize and to question the government. The political opposition brings up objections to how the government is working, brings up commentary on what the government is not doing well, brings up potential alternatives to what the government is currently doing, and in so doing, forces the government to respond in some way, to react in some way, because otherwise, the government risks that the people will buy this criticism and agree with the criticism and vote for the opposition party. So that's how the checks and balances work here. There's a question in the chat. I'm going to answer this at the end of the slide. The second part of the separation of powers is the executive branch. And very often when you refer to the executive branch, you also interchangeably say government, because they are the ones who in practice govern. They implement the laws that the executive has voted in. So the ministries, the departments, the agencies, which are headed by a head of the executive branch. In the USA, that's the president, who implement the laws that are voted in by the legislature. Now, there are checks and balances between the legislative and the executive. Those checks and balances differ between types of political systems. In a presidential system, the president has more power than the parliament. In the parliamentary, it's vice versa. In a semi-presidential system like France, they are relatively equal in power. I'm not going to go into explanation of what all of these different types of systems mean. You can research that on your own, because it's a lot of technicalities and unnecessary nuance. But there are always checks and balances. So, for example, in the USA, the president can issue a veto on a bill of Congress. But then the Congress, if it has a sufficiently big enough majority, can override the presidential veto. Presidents in the US can sometimes use executive orders to bypass the Congress. But if the Congress creates a law that overrides an executive order, then Congress can remove that executive order from power. So there are different ways in which the executive and the legislative can control each other. This is very important in situations where the legislative and executive are not controlled by the same party. So, for example, in the USA, you can have a Republican Congress, but you can have a Democratic president. And this is, again, a way in which the political opposition can also exert some kinds of checks and balances and control and accountability. Lastly, and this is crucial, is the judicial branch. The judicial branch provides independent oversight over the actions of government. This is important, because if the government is not protecting the basic rights which should be guaranteed to the people of that country, if the government is acting in a way which you believe is illegal, illegitimate, unconstitutional, you need to be able to implement some kind of recourse towards that government, because otherwise you get, in Croatia we have a saying, kadija te tuži, kadija ti sudi, which means the same person who is suing you is also your judge. So if you're unhappy with the government and you think the government is doing something illegal and unconstitutional, if you complain to the same government that's doing it, that's not gonna go well down for you. So you need to have a string of institutions where you can challenge the government, and that is the judicial branch. That is, for example, the Supreme Court of the USA, who can strike down laws passed by Congress or executive orders passed by presidents if it deems them to be unconstitutional. The judicial branch is not only important for securing your rights against other people. So if somebody, killed a member of your family, if somebody stole from you, if somebody tricked you, you can go to the court to get restitution, to get that person in prison, to get some kind of, compensation. But they're also important to protect you against the state, because you can challenge the state. And one of the best ways to notice if a democracy is backsliding towards authoritarianism is to look at how independent the judiciary is. If the ruling party is just able to stock the courts with its own candidates and just capture the courts, like it happened in Poland a couple of years ago, while the PIS party was still in power, that's a very good sign that democracy in that country is backsliding. Now, of course, there is always some influence of the legislative and executive on the judiciary. So, for example, Supreme Court justices are appointed by US presidents. So people who are appointed by Trump are obviously conservative, which means that Trump at least had the influence of appointing a conservative to that position, but they are not bound to the legislative by, any kind of accountability. So a Supreme Court justice in the USA is a Supreme Court justice for life. They're not elected. They cannot be removed by the president. So they are, in that sense, free to act in whichever way their conscience dictates. They cannot be held to account by the government. And this is crucial because this presents the way to challenge the government. Now, in the USA, the Supreme Court was crucial in outlawing segregation of schools, in Brown v. Board of Education, in allowing access to abortion in Roe v. Wade, which unfortunately backslided recently, but it was a crucial, verdict. In the Miranda case, which institutionalized the Miranda rights, so the right to remain silent, the right to have an attorney, etc., etc. So this is incredibly important. So some of the questions in the chat. Okay. The first one is, can you contextualize this, say, in the example of Russia? Why was there no stop to monopolization of powers by Putin? Well, because Russia at that point was not a functional democracy. There was no meaningful opposition to challenge Putin. There was no competitor on elections which could win against Putin. There was no separation of powers. There was no independent judiciary who would rule Putin unconstitutional and remove him from power. So he entered a system which was still very much in transition from authoritarianism and totalitarianism into a fledgling democracy, which was rife with corruption, rife with nepotism, and he simply rode that situation to monopolize power, and he was able to capture the state. The Russian courts are controlled by the United Russia Party. The Russian Duma, the parliament, is controlled by the United Russia Party. And when the ruling party controls all three branches, there is no checks and balances. Okay, the earlier question about giving people rights was now contextualized, which is 2016 WDC quarterfinal about granting a state to African Americans. Prop argues that there is a principle of reparation to grant them a state. If op argument is that granting a state is not meaningful as it will create chaos and a non-functioning government, how should they weigh as prop and win as op? Given that meaningful or not is based on material satisfaction, is it a utility argument? On the other hand, it can also be a principle argument, which makes the counter argument a valid competing principle argument if meaningful or not answers if prop's principle of reparation is valid in any way that prop reparation is not stopping harm. So the way that you weigh on proposition is to say the following: regardless of whether this works or not, if we establish that there is indeed a reparatory duty, then this reparatory duty should be fulfilled by the one who owes that duty. Because if the motion happens, and it does happen in this case from it's not an actor motion, but the one implementing the policy is the United States of America. If we establish that the United States of America has a reparatory duty to people of color, and if we establish that the reparatory duty is as large that it can only be fulfilled by the granting of a state, it therefore follows that there is a moral obligation to create that state. Whether or not the state will be functional or not is then a non-starter of a question, because the obligation exists regardless of whether it's going to work out or not. So obligations can exist regardless of the consequences of the material ways in which you fulfill that obligation. The question then of how how you win as opposition, I think, is by arguing not just it's not going to work, and this is why opening opposition lost the debate, but to use it's not going to work as practical mitigation, and then to also argue what CEO did, how it's going to screw up other people of color who, for example, are left in the United States and now face more racism, who presumably also should have that reparatory duty fulfilled towards them. And that's how you significantly wash out the proposition principle. And then the second question was, would you say that the anti-Putin campaign was a threat to Putin given Putin's action towards them? I'm assuming you mean Alexei Navalny and the protests against the Putin government. So I don't think that they were a realistic threat to Putin. They were never able to get more than a couple tens of thousands of people to protest in Moscow and St. Petersburg, which for Russia is basically nothing. But Putin has had a history of eliminating his opponents ever before they actually become relevant. This includes Navalny, this includes the attacks on Sergei and Yulia Skripal, this includes the elimination of Boris Nemtsov, this includes the elimination of Anna Politkovskaya. Putin very quickly moves to eliminate people who he thinks might be a threat to him. The death of Yevgeny Prigozhin also probably has something to do with Putin ultimately, right? But I don't think they were a realistic threat. Then the question is, so selection of judges is crucial for separation of power, and is there a best way? I will not claim to be an expert in how judiciary branches work in different countries. I am ultimately a political science student, not a law student. So I cannot give you the answer whether there is institutionally the best possible way to do this. But the answer to the first question is yes. How judges are selected, how much pressure and coercion the government can exert on these judges, and how independent they are in making the decision is indeed crucial for a separation of power, because this is the branch that is supposed to be independent recourse against the government, especially in a situation where both the legislature and the executive are held by the same party. Another question. If a government has a reparation duty, do I as a politician have a duty to advocate for it, or should I morally have such a moral interest as I, as a politician, am part of the government duty? This is a trade-off question, right? It's a weighing question. So people have different moral principles, we have different moral compasses, and sometimes our different moral intuitions will clash. This is why we as humans sometimes have moral crises or moral dilemmas. This is why we have thought experiments like the how do you call it? Oh my God, if I forgot the name of this, I can't believe it. My mind is blocking. The one where you have the trolley and you have the trolley problem, right? The trolley problem. Because sometimes our moral intuitions can clash. Maybe I feel that there is some extent of duty towards the government, but I also feel that my government is not being fair to the people of color. So you have to decide which of these is more important for you. In debating, the team that's going to win is the team that better analyzes which trade-off the actor is going to choose and why. If it's not an actor motion, still. So if you're debating about objectively, if you're debating about what a politician will do, the team that wins is a team that best explains within the different moral intuitions a politician can have, which of these he is more likely to prioritize and why. Most debates are a question of likelihood, right? Which decision is an actor likely to make and what are the reasons therefore? Okay, let's move on to the next slide. The final question in the principles of democratic government. And the final question here is how to ensure protection of minorities within a majoritarian system. What do I mean by this? Democracy is ultimately majoritarian, right? The party that has the most votes and therefore the support of the majority of the people will be the one that has the most seats in parliament. That party will therefore also be the one to form the government. So how do we ensure that the majority does not tyrannize the minority? How do we ensure the minority has some say in the country, some form of protection? Firstly, through minority rights. So there are rights of minorities based on who they are as minorities that are protected in law, starting from general rights, such as everybody has the right to freedom of speech, of conscience, of religion, of employment, to more specific rights based on the type of minority we are discussing. Maybe there is an ethnic minority and we are enshrining the right of that minority to education in their language, to have court cases heard in their language to, how do you say, pursue their religion. If we're talking about gender minorities, maybe we ensure that LGBTQ people have the right to marry, or we ensure that people have access to gender-affirming surgery. It can depend on the minority. Secondly, you need to have a vibrant civil society. There need to be NGOs, watchdog organizations, which, first of all, actively work to provide and enforce minority rights. We're talking about feminist organizations, for example, which provide access to legal aid.
बैग लेना भूल गए ना केवल वापस लो
Which provide legal aid for women who are in court cases for domestic violence or for sexual assault. We are talking about organizations which provide microfinance loans to people who are in poverty, but also NGOs which are going to call out the government, which are going to criticize the government for not doing enough to protect minorities, etc. But lastly, the answer is political opposition. So the minority should still be represented in parliament. They're not in government, but they're in parliament. They have people who will speak out for them, and the way in which this works and why it's important, I already answered on the previous slide. There are just a couple of things I want to finally mention on this slide. First of all, I want to mention a very important insight of Karl Popper, a philosopher of democracy, where he claimed that an overly democratic democracy, an overly tolerant system, will become a tyranny of the majority. The will of the people must be limited in some way, because if the will of the people is to eliminate other parts of the people, then a democracy is no longer a democracy. It becomes a tyranny of the majority over the minority. So democracy is the rule of the people, but it can never be the absolute rule of the people. It has to be a rule of the majority in which minority rights are protected. However, unfortunately, this also runs into a question of practical implementation. First of all, because there is an incentive to repress minorities if they're seen as a threat to the power of the ruling actors, right? If there is a minority which you perceive to have sufficient political and economic capital to challenge your rule, you have an incentive to demonize that minority, to villainize that minority in order to prevent them from gaining power to meaningfully challenge you. Ultimately, what happened in World War II was a consequence of Hitler having that perception of the Jews. They are a group who are a minority, but with too much power within Germany, and they are working from within to dismantle the Germany we know and love, which of course is a completely deluded conception, but that was the conception that guided him to write Mein Kampf and then all the things that happened after that. But also, there's a lot of incentive in politics to scapegoat minorities through populist us versus them narratives. Because one of the easiest ways to gather political support is to identify a political problem and then pin that problem to an enemy. If only we were to remove these people, we can succeed. And we can solve the problem. This is efficient, first of all, because it gives people someone to blame. It mobilizes anger and frustration. But secondly, because it gives a very easy solution. Just put these people out of the country and everything's going to be fine. That is the cornerstone of the narrative of right-wing populists in Europe right now. These migrants are taking your jobs, threatening your culture, making your borders unsafe. The solution is clear. We must direct our anger towards the migrants. We must remove them from the country. There's very often an incentive to scapegoat instead of to protect. And all of these problems of practical implementation, which I talked about in this slide, and the previous ones, are the reason why there is no such thing as a perfect democracy, and why the only thing we can do is measure the level of imperfection within the system, but we never ultimately get perfection. Before I move on to the final slide of the lecture, again, up to a minute and a half for questions. Okay, there seem to be no questions. So I'll just move on. And this is the last slide I want to discuss before just giving you guys a list of motions. I just want to clarify immediately, when I do give you the list of motions where I think this lecture could be useful, I'm not going to go through those motions, nor are we going to discuss arguments for those motions, because that's not the, first of all, there's no time for it, but that's also not the point of the lecture. The point of this is to give you those motions, and then you yourselves on your own think about how you can apply this lecture to cases for those motions, just to clarify that before going on to anything else. Okay, the last question I want to address in this lecture is how much the state should get involved in regulation, especially when it comes to regulating markets. So how top-down, hands-on should the state be in terms of implementing laws and regulations and restrictions on liberty? Because there's a debate here, and this also kind of ties back to one of the previous questions I got, which was, do we have to weigh between life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? This is one of the most important weigh-offs between those values, between one perception, one conception which prioritizes liberty, and another which prioritizes limitations on liberty for societal well-being, which would be, the pursuit of happiness in this case, right? So, as I've said, there are two broad and distinct positions based on the regulatory role of the state and how much a state should be engaged in regulation. And those spring from two distinct views on freedom, two distinct views on liberty. One view emphasizes negative freedom. Now, I'm using the terms negative freedom and positive freedom. They are terms coined by philosopher Isaiah Berlin. I will emphasize immediately, negative freedom doesn't mean bad freedom. It's not negative because it's bad. It's negative because it negates restriction. So negative freedom is the absence of restrictions. The conception of negative freedom emphasizes that freedom of choice and freedom of action should be maximized to the largest possible extent. And this means that only the most basic and necessary restrictions on liberty should be imposed by the state. From this perception come concepts such as the night watchman state, the idea of a state which only has minimal interference, which has the military to protect its borders, and has the police and the courts to ensure that contracts are respected and that people are not violent towards each other. And everything else is up to the freedom of the people. Do they want to do drugs, alcohol, risk their lives, sell themselves into slavery? Doesn't matter. This is, of course, a radical ideal type conception, but the libertarian part of the political spectrum, for example, emphasizes this necessity for the state to reduce its regulatory role. From this perception, you will also very often hear the motto, taxation is theft. The state is not allowed to take my money. Why should the state have the right to my money? I freely worked for it. I should be free to use it. From this perception, you will get the drive towards market deregulation. People should be free to buy and offer goods and services on the market without the state interfering in it by capping prices, by implementing value-added tax, by regulating how products can be advertised, etc., etc. It should be up to the willing decisions of people on the market. The other conception of liberty emphasizes positive freedom. Positive freedom puts an emphasis not just on whether you are free to do something in the sense of there being no restrictions, but whether you are able to do something, whether you have the capacity to do something. So positive freedom will emphasize, although you might be negatively free to undertake an action, you might not have the actual agency to do so. So if I want to go to university, in Croatia, maybe not a good example because university is free, but in the USA, if I want to go to university, if it's not illegal to go to university, and it's not, and if nobody is tying me with handcuffs to my table so I cannot go to university, I am negatively free to go to university. There are no restrictions which stop me from going to university. But if I don't have the money to go to university, then I'm not positively free to do so because I don't have the capacity. So absence of restrictions is not sufficient. From this idea stems the conception that the state must regulate to maximize positive freedom, to maximize capacity, because the state is the one with the most resources and power to do so. So the state should do things like mitigate inequality. If it is a reason, for example, if the reason why I cannot go to university is that I am poor, and if the reason why I am poor is because I'm from a minority background, then maybe the state should implement affirmative action. Maybe the state should provide welfare payments to people from those communities, etc. The state should also regulate excesses of markets, because the free and willing actions of people in markets can sometimes lead to monopolies, can sometimes lead to people to products such as medicine, internet access being priced too much for most people to access them. This impacts their positive freedom, so it should be regulated. The state should publicly invest in infrastructure, education, in healthcare, because all of those things maximize people's positive freedom. So different views on freedom lead to different views of how much the state should get involved in a regulatory role. Okay, that's it for the lecture. These are some of the example motions that I think this lecture can be useful in. Again, as I said, I'm not going to go through the arguments for these motions, because the purpose is that you engage in your own critical work and critical thought to apply what you've learned here to those motions. But I will now allow a final Q&A. So if there are any other questions remaining for this lecture, you can ask them now in the chat. Okay, another question in the chat. Can I argue that democracy in and of itself is dictatorship, given it's based on a social contract? I did not consent to birth, and I'm already signed in the contract. I want to quit, but I cannot convince the majority. I'm stuck in the contract. I'm not allowed to sign out, given there ain't enough people wanting to sign out. And in fact, the contract is based on the assumption that the state will allow people to sign out of the contract. Okay, that's a loaded one. I would agree with the logic that you make. I would say that this is not proof that democracy is a dictatorship. I would say it's proof that the life is never consented into, which is to say that we are born into this world unconsensually. This is one of the arguments why it might, in the motion, this house believes it is immoral to have children, that you can never get positive, informed, and retractable consent from an unborn child, whether it wants to be born. And ultimately, we are all coerced into living. But this is not a consequence of democracy as a political system. This is true of any person born into the world, regardless where they are born. I would also agree that you are stuck in the contract. But the reason you are stuck in the contract is not because the country is a democracy. It's because of the third part of the state power principle. And that's because states are unavoidable. You can sever your social contract with India and you can go to Croatia, but you're still going to be in a social contract, just with Croatia, not with India. So I would agree with the logic there, just not with the conclusions. At what point a separatist group becomes a state? Is the Taliban a state? Oof, another loaded one. Right. It's kind of the same as it is with rights, right? So remember when I said that if you go to North Korea and you say, I have a right to freedom of speech, nobody's going to care, you're going to end up in jail. It's very similar with states. Whether states are actually states, there is no legal procedure for making a state. There is no document you get signed by the doctor that says you are now a state, right? Whether a state is considered a state depends on whether others treat it as a state. So it depends on international recognition, right? Whether others will trade with that state, whether others will respect the sovereignty of that state, whether others will accept the borders of that state, whether they will admit the state in international organizations such as the UN or the EU, etc. So insofar as the Taliban are isolated from the international community, they are a state to the extent to which they exercise legitimate monopoly of physical power within their own territory. So internally, we can call them a state. Externally, they are not treated as a state. Their borders are not respected. Their sovereignty is not respected by the international community. They're not engaged with in relations that in which you do as a state. So there is no clear-cut answer to this, because whether one is a state depends on, first of all, whether one has control over the legitimate exercise of political force on a territory. And sometimes the answer is not clear. So is the Libyan state a state? Like there's one government in Tripoli, but there's another provisional government somewhere else in Libya. It's not full sovereignty. It also depends on whether other states treat it as a state. Like is externally, is Kosovo a state, right? Half the world recognizes Kosovo, half doesn't. So yeah, you just asked this the question. What about countries where half of the other countries recognize and others not, like Palestine? Again, depends on perception, right? Because from the perspective of Slovenia, Palestine is definitely a state. They recognize it. From the perspective of Croatia, it isn't. But the consequence of the fact that it doesn't have full recognition is that there can currently be a war in Gaza in the shape in which it does. If Palestine were an independent nation, this war would not have happened, at least it wouldn't have happened in the shape in which it happens now. But because half of the world, including some of the most powerful countries in the world like the USA, don't recognize Palestine, allows for the current situation. So it all depends on whether the international community by consensus decides that you are a state or not. There's no other answer, no clear-cut answer to the question. Okay, if there are no other questions, and there seem to not be any other questions, I would wrap up the lecture at this point.